Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. 1 year later, Joshua Dysart is back on the Comics Cube, and we're going to talk about Odinns Eye from Bad Idea. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah,
I can't believe it's been a year.
Yeah, I know. It's been both an eventful year and an uneventful year. Like nobody went anywhere or did anything. We briefly thought the pandemic was over, but it turned out it was just mutating.
No.
So yeah.
Whatever doesn't kill you mutates into something stronger.
Yes, that's right. It makes you crazy. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you crazy.
Well, I'm certainly hoping that you don't know anyone personally who is, taking horse dewormers instead of a vaccine.
I don't. No, I don't. We have had some tragedies in the family. Somebody who has been vaccinated, but he's an elder gentleman. So it's dark. So yeah, that's okay. Thank you. It's true of so many people over the last year. So it's nothing special. But man, if you have family members in your 80s who are vaccinated, still be very, very, very careful around them. So that's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, breakthrough cases. Still, though, at a much lower rate than if you're unvaccinated.
Unquestionably, statistically, it's do it. Yeah.
So get vaccinated, people.
Get vaccinated. Yeah, exactly.
So in the time since you announced Odinns Eye, coming from Bad Idea, I have to admit I'd never heard of Bad Idea. So before this, so what drew you to the company?
Well, it's something that we all sort of started together, my friends and I, all of us basically who were involved in Valiant together. And the lessons that we learned from Valiant, essentially Valiant Comics was sort of like a Mongolian press where the Mongol army used to fight on one front and then rush manically to the opposite front and then immediately throw themselves into the fight without resting to make the enemy believe that they were a much larger force. And that's what we did for about 10 years at Valiant, which was push on all sides. And, people were constantly getting ill and stress-induced illnesses. And it was hard on families and stuff. And so we decided when we were going to make our own company that we didn't want to do that again. And so we are an intentionally small company that does a lot of really weird, interesting things designed specifically to slow growth, but keep interest high. We can be sometimes hard to find. You can only specific retailers can carry Bad Idea comics, but they do mail ordering. So if you go to the Bad Idea website, there'll be a store locator on that website, and you can contact somebody who will happily mail you physical copies. There are no digital copies for now. There are no collected trades for now, and we take huge breaks between publishing big lumps of books. So I've been involved with it from the very beginning, but this is my first book is finally coming out. So
your first book coming out. It is hashtagged as the Final Five. What does that mean?
Well, so in its this is the last 5 books of Bad Idea as it currently exists. So that's what I mean by slowing growth, slowing it to a virtual stop.
Well, I feel like the keywords there are as currently exists.
Yeah. You can approach it with
And I take it you're not going to explain any more than that.
It's not. No, I'm not going to. It's not my place to. Yeah.
Okay. Odinns Eye. So Odinns Eye, can you give me your elevator pitch for Odinns Eye?
Yeah. A 6th century Geet girl has a seizure disorder. And whenever she seizes, she believes that All-Father or Odinn is speaking to her, but she can't quite understand what he is saying because she's just a person and All-Father is a god. And her family and her convinced the local chieftain that this is happening, and the chieftain sends his vulva, which is like a kind of pre-Germanic witch. Not exactly, but for the purposes of this pitch, we'll call her a witch. And she determines that the little girl is in fact communing with the larger plane, and a bunch of heroes are assigned to her, and they travel even further north than where they are to see if they can discover what it is exactly Odin wants from her. And that's the pitch. However, it's something else entirely. It evolves and changes and grows, and but that's the pitch. A little girl and her heroes travel north to see what Odin asks of her.
We know that Odin's eye is what he gave up to gain wisdom.
Yes, or poetry, depending on the translation. But yes, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How is it that far? Poetry
is
and
wisdom really so far from poetry?
That's a good point. This is why you're a writer.
Oh, well, you know. If you just act like things are meaningful and you say them with a certain amount of gravitas, you can get away with some false meaning.
Yeah, I was talking to Walt Simonson a few months ago, and I was talking to him about that story where he turned Thor into a frog.
Yes.
And he was just like, as long as you say things with a straight face, you can get away with anything.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah.
Well, that's actually a good segue, speaking of Walt, to my next question. Have you always been a fan of Norse mythology?
Okay, so I am a big fan of how human beings tell stories in general, and the human conversation that comes from them. So it's not so much that I've always been obsessed with Norse mythology, but this idea of the Indo-European migration coming out of South Asia, migrating into Europe, and carrying a myth structure that has a lot of very, just a lot of surviving symbols. A great tree on which the world is hung, an All-Father who is hung from that tree, who seeks knowledge, who is pierced in his side by a spear at some point. I'm really interested in how symbols and manifestations of stories and fragments of stories move through humanity, what they mean, and also how we can use them to trace human migration, human evolution, and ultimately how we can use them to destroy the concept of segregated cultures or pure racial and ethnic identities, because because once we start digging into the meat of these stories, what we find is that they all overlap in one massive great Venn diagram of human migration. So that's what's interesting to me. So that's why this is set so far back in the 6th century, where we don't have any real understanding of what the Proto-Germanics, how they interacted with these stories, or for lack of a better term, like how they were Odinists. We really don't know. Did they, we don't know if they treated them like gods. We don't know if it was just stories they told to help them make sense of their life. We don't understand how they interacted with their symbols. Almost everything we know about Norse mythology was written down after the Christianization of the Germanic peoples. So if we go this far back, if we go pre-Christianization by 300, 400 years, if we go 200 years before what we would understand as a Viking culture, which is also a misuse of that word, but for the purposes of this, if we go further back, then I'm in this beautiful gray area where I can do no wrong. Nobody knows anything about really how it was. And we have very few. I mean, I believe we only really have one eyewitness report of these pre-Germanic peoples, or these Germanic peoples, from a Roman educated Arab who was traveling amongst them at that time. And so I've read all of his histories of his travels in the extreme north of that period, but that's pretty much the only data we have. And we don't know historically how accurate that is or anything. So that's all super interesting to me. So if I place it that far back in the past, I'm not beholden to any sort of pre-conditioned idea of Norse mythology. I'm not beholden to a very hard line concept of Odinism or Norse mythology. So it's pretty exciting to work in that space. So some people may hate it. If there's people who really love Norse mythology, they may hate what we're doing, but we're exploring this kind of like amorphous fog of history. Yeah.
I did notice like there's been kind of a resurgence, I think,
Yeah.
in Norse mythology over the last
Yeah.
several years.
Leave it to me to drop a book right in the middle of the time when everybody is dropping a book about this is the story of my life.
Why do you think that is? What is the appeal of Norse mythology compared to, you know, Greek or Roman or well, I guess Greek and Roman are the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, in a way, everything, every fantasy construct that we consume today, particularly in the West, but globally, is somehow influenced by Norse mythology, right? So Game of Thrones is Norse mythology, with its, you know, White Walkers and its far wall. All that shit comes from Norse mythology. Of course, Lord of the Rings is slavishly Norse mythology, with going so far as having Gandalf be Odin himself, or the All-Father, or the Hanging God, or, you know, whatever term you want to use. And we can go on and on and on. What we perceive as any fantasy construct, especially if it's tied to a Western fantasy, an idea of a Western fantasy setting, that is Norse mythology, right? Like, you get very, very little Greco-Roman mythological like substrate of our fantasy stories anymore. I don't know if that's because it's too distant. I don't know if it's because there was a time when that felt overused. I don't know if white people just tell the story, you know, and over instead of Mediterraneans, you know, tell the stories of fantasy cultures and stuff. So I don't know why, but it is embedded at the heart of almost all popular fantasy stories in the West. And I thought it was interesting to break that, to both embrace it and break it, and try to do something new with it, and kind of reclaim it and change it and look at it in a different light, a more primal kind of nature, you know, go back to this sort of nature celebration, get away from the Lord of the Rings idea of fantasy, where all the bad guys are like the dark orcs or the black dusky, you know what I mean? Like all that in Gandalf the White versus the dark orcs. Like it's just, I just want to break all that, shed all of that.
Dangerously kind of racist subtext there.
I mean, I would argue the Lord of the Rings is incredibly racist, but I know that's not a popular opinion. But I think that.
You mean the sword that only detects one race when it's nearby isn't racist?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that I thought this would be an interesting thing to take the very source code of something like Lord of the Rings and then reshape it, refashion it, toss all this kind of, I think, tired old stuff. Other people don't. I mean, these are the most popular properties in entertainment, so I'm not sure if, you know, everyone agrees with me.
You are setting this all the way in the past, but it seems, talking to you, you are very interested in communicating modern messages. So, for example, reshaping the architecture of something like Lord of the Rings to fit a more inclusive atmosphere. You're talking about how Norse mythology and other mythologies kind of blend together in this Venn diagram, and I think that that's an important lesson for today. You know, like people who fight about the differences in the religions always forgetting about how similar they are. Like,
yeah. Yeah, I'm so tired of like the canonization of texts, you know, when somebody talks about like, what is a culture? Like, what is a culture really? I mean, I guess if you're making some kind of argument of a purist, you know, ethnicity or ethnic culture, then you got to look to your texts, right? And no text, no ancient text, no source text has survived untouched by another culture. everything that we consider the Western canon went through, particularly during like the collapse of the West, went through Arabic lands and Arabic hands. I've talked about this before, but something that's really interesting to me is people believe that Aladdin was naturally part of 1001 Arabian Nights, and it wasn't. It was added later, and and because Aladdin, if the actual story takes place theoretically in China, but it's difficult because it looks like there may have been a time when a lot of Arabic stories chose to place themselves in China because it was an exotic, faraway locale. And so we don't see, for instance, like we see in Aladdin, we see Judaica and we see Islam, but we don't see Confucianism or Buddhism or anything. So, this is how we feel we know where it's placed, but we're not entirely sure because there was a lot of Arab culture moving through the Silk Road into China. There's to this very day, there's still Islamic sects in China. You don't know where this story comes from. We can pretty much figure it out by looking at the clues and the cultural footprints throughout the story, but we don't really know. So I'm tired of this idea of cultural purity or textual, some kind of like a textual test of a culture. It's all just complete bullshit.
And the thing that you've been in war zones, so you've seen firsthand how that kind of thing plays out, right?
Oh, in relation to, like, what do you mean? Just sort of how cultures get all
how cultures get all mixed up. Yeah.
And forced migration. One thing war causes is tremendous forced migration. And one thing about our story is there was a 3-year-long winter that occurred in the 6th century in the Northern Hemisphere. And the dominant theory is because there was a very large volcano in the Southern Hemisphere that caused a kind of an impact winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But there's a lot of different theories as to what caused it. But the point is that it changed the entire shape of Europe forever. And people, the way people moved, and so our story sort of takes place a little bit in this period. And interestingly enough, that long winter may have ultimately led to groups moving south towards Rome and ultimately ending up in what we would call like the barbarians sacking Rome, which is really just, Visigoths and all sorts of other ethnic groups moving south because of a protracted winter that caused damage to crops all over the world.
Yeah, they had to do it to survive.
Yeah, exactly. And so to your point about war is like, we have these moments of forced migration and they change landscapes and culture and the way ethnicities combine forever. And they're happening all the time. One is happening in Afghanistan right now. You're going to have, you're going to have 500,000 people leaving that country, and they're going to bring their culture into other places. And, it's been going on since Bush Jr.'s policies in the Middle East led to massive migrations. But this is just the story of the world and the story of humanity. And that's why it's so intolerable. Any sort of ethnic purity argument is so intolerable.
Going a little off tangent, how do you feel about the stuff going on in Afghanistan right now?
It's a complete and utter disaster. And it's just another example in a long line of examples of American foreign policy.
You think there's any way it couldn't have been a disaster?
I don't know. It's a huge topic. It's impossible to discuss it in any way that is not going to fill volumes of texts. The Taliban in the 90s in Afghanistan were horrible regime. I can't make any argument for whether we should have unseated them or not, but we basically spent going back to Reagan, really, we've just spent 40 years making terrible choices in Afghanistan, from arming the Mujahideen to, on and on and on. So I I don't see, I mean, it was inevitable that it would be this disaster, but it's frustrating that we, you know, it's just really frustrating to be part of this, and to have our Secretary of State Blinken say, that our mission succeeded has got to be one of the most infuriating things I've heard, certainly come out of the Biden administration so far. And that person should lose his job for saying that. I wish that the night that he said that he, that everything he owned was in Afghanistan, that every cent he owned was in an Afghan bank, every person he loved was in Afghanistan the day he said, our mission was a success.
What a terrible thing to say.
Well, it's just incredible. Yeah. On the eve of millions of people losing, all hope and certainty. Yeah. So it's just American foreign policy, just being disastrous and short-sighted.
Being a prick.
Yeah.
Guy.
Yeah. Like, Blinken. Yeah, man.
Yeah. So going back a little bit to the canonization of text. So I've experienced that a little bit here as well in the Philippines. A friend of mine lives all the way up north in the mountains, right?
Oh, I bet it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. But like you go up there, because I went up there for her engagement ceremony. It involves cows and chickens, and it's a whole thing. But then awesome. I'm talking to her aunt, right? And her aunt was saying things like, now we have to please the gods. So you keep talking about the gods. But then when I ask about it, they say that, oh, there's only one God, the Christian God.
Oh, yeah.
So basically what the Spanish did was they took what was there and then they grafted Catholicism onto it.
Yeah.
Now, given how it seems that all of this stuff has adapted and been, has gone through all of these changes just to make it more palatable to whatever people there were at the time that they were trying to sell it to. Why do you think text is so canonized, given the text goes through so many changes?
I think it's really important to people who are in charge, and often not rightfully so, to lionize and fetishize these texts to keep people, to keep people under their sway. Catholicism in particular is really fascinating. It's like the cockroach of faith systems. It goes into any environment, it seems, and into any culture, and seems to coexist. If you look at like the West Indies and stuff, you'll see a lot of indigenous faith systems existing simultaneously and sometimes threaded through Catholicism. It's really fascinating in that way, which probably speaks to its origins as a faith system created by the Romans, as they converted to Christ or Christianity, which they may or may not have done solely for political reasons. But I think that it's always been really important to people to use these texts and this idea of cultural or ethnic purity to maintain control, to maintain control. I mean, I personally believe religion is a product of our fear of death, and it's about us being afraid to die and desperate to not view the world for what it is, which is a sort of consumption reproductive machine, and to give it some sort of grander meaning. Having said that, I don't mean to disregard somebody's faith. I just think that that faith in something is bigger than the thing that you're placing your faith in, the human act of having faith in the thing. But I think that's why these texts are so important. They're important to individuals who live hard lives, because they look to these texts as a way to have meaning, and to push out this dark concept, the dark cloud of the universe is just suffering and pain and death and rot, and at the same time, and then governments and religions and proxy organizations that thrive in government and religion, they all, it's all really, they exploit that need, and that's why these texts are like this. You know, there's a lot of people who profit from this idea of like cultural supremacy, or you know, or that we're different, and you know, nationalism is a form of that, which has, you know, as we see, is having a massive you know, resurrection throughout the world.
I know. Wear a mask,
yeah.
people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, the politicization of issues like the pandemic, like it's so crazy that the way the pandemic has been politicized. So I just think it's just another tool for the powerful to use to keep us from, you know, from sort of like being over their bullshit, as it were.
Crazy.
Yeah. They have lots of tools.
They have so many tools.
And we don't really have that many tools.
No. But one of the tools is art, Joshua. So.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Yeah, 100%.
Right. And you are a huge part of that. So
I'm not a huge part of it. I am a very, very small part of it, but I do my best.
All of you artists say the same thing.
Like, well, there's so many of us that, you know, it's like there's a lot of us, and some of us do better work than others.
You're also humble and self-deprecating.
I would argue that humility, well, first of all, I mean, I would argue that humility is the path, right? You're only going to really ever be good and cause as little harm as possible to others if you're humble. But also, I think artistically, it really helps you grow, because the minute you're like, I'm the shit, you have stopped growing, right? You're like not seeking to break and rework your art anymore. So.
That's true. I think there are a few people in the comic book community that kind of fit that description.
I mean, everywhere, right? Like, I mean, if somebody is like, I'm a hell of a writer, I'm like, I bet you're not. I bet you're not.
You were 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So for Odinns Eye, your main character Solveig is a little girl, and who suffers seizures. So what is the importance right now to the story of having a little girl be the main character? Because I feel like young people, I was going to say little people, young people as protagonists can kind of be a gateway to kids also picking up books.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about that. It is on the surface, its content is very, is very kid friendly. There's not too much language. There's no sex. It's, it's ideologically and spiritually kind of a deep exploration of belief, which may not be something young kids are interested in at that time. But I mean, for me, I'm interested in young people for their vulnerability, their combination of a sort of innate wisdom combined with total narcissism, just like an uncivilized nature, shy of us civilizing them, and so that's always really exciting. So they're fun characters, and then plus, I'm a father of my daughters are both fully grown now and everything, but I watched a little girl, a little girl become a person, and that was endlessly fascinating. So I gravitate to that sort of protagonist, and when you throw someone that is so fragile into such a hostile world, it's just good storytelling. It's just really interesting. It's a bit of a cheat, to be honest. I mean, everybody likes to make these really badass, tough protagonists, and to me, it's far less engaging to see someone with all the tools they need to overcome the strife of their world. Like, why do I want to watch that? I want to watch somebody with no tools, with no power, like be thrown into the struggle of the world. So, is that difficult?
Is that difficult to write?
I don't know. I mean, it's just difficult. Everything's difficult to write. It's really hard. But I think it's a cheat. So no, I think it's less difficult. I think because you're like leaning on the fragility of it, right? So you can, if you want an emotional beat it's way tougher to squeeze an emotional beat out of some hardened badass than it is a little girl's face. And if Tomas Giorello is drawing your little girl's face, it's even easier to squeeze an emotional beat out of it. So.
You know, you saying everything is hard to write. You know, I follow a lot of writing pages, you know, pages about writing, and it seems to be a common theme that writers actually hate the act of writing.
Yeah, it sucks. Well, I mean, sometimes it's
you like being done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's awesome when you're done and everybody's like, this is great, or not, or they hate it, but at least you're over it. But yeah, man, it's hard. But look, you know, there is probably, for every 4 hours of writing, there's probably 10 minutes of bliss. And that's what you're going for when you're in the flow state and the ideas are coming and you're as surprised by the concepts that are coming out as you hope that the reader will be later. This is that 10 minutes is that's the high that you know, that the addict that is the writer is always chasing, right?
And so seizures, what was the prompt for, you know, what was the inspiration for?
It's a couple of things. Yeah, it's a couple of things. Like, I really wanted, you know, this is about Norse mythology, but really it's about like how humans believe in things and religion in general and faith. And there's a very long tradition throughout all human cultures of giving yourself up to a spirit, or, you know, losing your sense of self, becoming more vulnerable in the face of a spirit. You know, it's speaking in tongues, it's all this other stuff. And then I also have always been really, really fascinated about by concepts that we have a firmer grasp on now, like biology or neurochemistry, but how they were looked at in worlds that were lit only by magic instead of lit by science. So what is, you know, what is someone with a seizure disorder? How are they viewed by a society lit by magic instead of a society lit by science? So all these things are really interesting to me, but I think that I'm always really bored when the gods are like the greater mind. Lately, I've been thinking lots about a larger consciousness than humanity's. I'm personally an atheist, but I long for, like everybody else, I long for there to be a God. So I've been thinking about that a lot. And fantasy narratives are exciting because in fantasy narratives, gods get to be real. God is real and affirmed, and the presence of them in your life is often everything from auguries to, you know, to them actually just speaking to you or whatever. So, but I can't help but imagine how the frail, simple human mind would take in the larger, greater mind of a god, and that's kind of where all that comes together to create that seizure disorder narrative. It makes her more frail, but it also taps into a lot of this like sort of tent revival religiosity that I grew up with in the American South. My grandmother, my great grandmother, you know, she was like a Christian healer, and so all that shit is like really interesting to me.
When you know, you're talking about being an atheist, but when you're writing fiction, it's real. As you're writing it, it's real in your mind, isn't it?
You know, what's so interesting about that is, if this story is about anything at all other than what it's about on the surface, it's about how what is real and what is believed, the difference between what's real and what someone believes, and how belief can impact reality. So that's really ultimately what the story is about. And so to your point, that's, yeah, exactly. So when I'm writing it, you know, I'm creating a world, I'm making the rules, I'm deciding if God is real or not. But the story itself it asks that question constantly. Are we experiencing this through the mind of a delusional, deeply religious little girl, or are we outside of her mind and witnessing an authentic fantasy world with a real and living God? And that's something the reader has to figure out.
That's interesting. Do you give an answer at the end?
I mean, I don't know. You have to read it. I'm not gonna, any question. I know I have this harsh light on me. I'm so sorry. Any question that you know, that has in the end attached to it, I'm not going to answer, obviously.
Did you do any? How much research did you do regarding seizures?
Oh, not enough.
Okay.
Not much at all. Yeah. A little bit. I read, I mean, not nearly as much as I did on the Norse mythology or the geek culture. And honestly, for the most part, I know I have a reputation for being really, really research heavy. And that's, you know, true in the past. But I'm trying to move into a whole slew of stories that I just sort of write from my inner 12-year-old self. So that didn't work. I, of course, sat down and read like a shit ton of stuff, but this is not going to be historical fiction. You know what I mean? Anyone who knows anything about this stuff is going to find places in this story where we blatantly tossed out reality for just to make cool, badass comics. Now it could be argued very successfully that seizure disorder was probably something I should have given a lot more respect to. But you know, it's a device and I'm a sinner. So there you go.
I find that fascinating because you are known to be very research heavy. And now you've picked a story at a time period which is not so well documented, basically, so you can make stuff up. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of if you ever saw the back matter to V for Vendetta, how apparently like David Lloyd wanted a period specific story and Alan Moore was like, let's just set it in the very near future so I don't have to do any research.
Which is amazing because, you know, if you read something like From Hell or something where the research is, you know, took years and years to do. Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's really funny. I really just came to a place, I think after Goodnight Paradise, you know, which was my graphic novel. We talked about it, but for people who never saw that, like about homeless culture in Los Angeles, and I was involved a lot in that issue. But after I finished that, I sort of promised myself that I would take the things that I loved when I was 12 years old, like Conan the Barbarian and ElfQuest and playing Dungeons. I would take these things and I would transmute them through through the things I'm interested in today as an adult, but that I would start servicing my inner 12-year-old. So that's the phase we're moving into now in my work, is the servicing of my inner 12-year-old. So expect a lot of fantasy and horror and, you know, stuff like that. But I can't abandon all my interests, obviously.
So when can we expect the Joshua Dysart reboot of Underdog?
I love this shirt. This is a classic, real Underdog shirt. I would happily write Underdog. I have no idea who owns the rights to Underdog. Is it public domain? Probably not.
I don't think so.
I doubt it. But call me if you're out there. I'll write Underdog. That sounds awesome.
How would you treat Underdog? No, wait, don't give me that idea.
I've given it no thought whatsoever.
And when was the final order cutoff for Odinns Eye?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I bet if you go to Bad Idea, you can find out.
Okay.
Badidea.com. Yeah. Or whatever the website is. I'm terrible at this. I'm so sorry.
And what prompted you guys to release it in December on a weekly basis?
Yes.
Why weekly?
Pretty excited about this move. Well, so, you know, look, the market right now is not great for longer narratives. People are releasing 4-issue arcs or 4-issue miniseries and things like this because the attrition in the numbers, you know, is significant. I was supposed to make Odinns Eye a 4-issue comic book, but I did not because I am a self-indulgent prick. So I made it incredibly long because I just don't like short stories. I don't like them. I like long, big, epic narratives. And I think comics is shooting itself in the foot, frankly, because the culture is moving towards consuming longer and longer narratives, right? Like TVs, and you can't even make a superhero movie for less than 2 hours now. It's less than 2 hours. So so the way we
some of them
this,
should still be less than 2 hours long.
I mean, absolutely. So you're not Bergman, just make your superhero movie, make your jingoistic disaster porn, and do it in 90 minutes and call it a day. But anyway, yeah, so I made a longer narrative, and fortunately my partners at Bad Idea indulged me. But Tomas and I have been working on this for ages. We started this before the pandemic, and it was just looking so beautiful, and everything was going, and we weren't finding a place in the schedule for it to work. That we finally just realized that we could dominate the month of December. We could release a really big narrative, but in a short amount of time, so that it stays in the news cycle, and we can really service the story more. Waiting a month between 20 to 22 page comic books it's a tough model as far as I'm concerned as a consumer. So this way you get your first issue drops the first Wednesday in December. It's 72 plus pages. It's actually issues 1 and 2 combined. And then after that, every issue is like 35 or more pages, 35 to 37 pages of story and art. And it's every Wednesday. And so it really feels like you're really kind of binging something big.
No ads.
No ads, because I'm the ad. Tomas Giorello's the ad. Yeah, no ads. I mean, we're just making comics over Bad Idea.
My last question about Odinns Eye is how amazing is Tomas Giorello?
I mean, what's the scale?
Look at this artwork right here. It's beautiful.
No, it's astounding. It's astounding. When the pages were coming in, it's just absolutely inspirational. Yeah, I mean, he's 70% of why this book is good. 80% of why this book is good. 90.
There's that humility and self-deprecation I was talking about.
Well, I mean, I do think it's pretty well written, but it's not as well written as it's well drawn. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to argue that point.
Well, I think also fans, because a lot of fans have this mentality that the writer does everything. And I don't think a lot of fans understand how much the artist actually has to drive that car.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I have different scripting styles for different artists. Alberto Ponticelli and I have been working for so long now that we have an entirely different scripting style. And he takes on a lot more of the especially now. In the future, there will be another Dysart Ponticelli book. And more than ever, that will be something that Ponticelli is driving visually, right? Mm-hmm. And I like that. This was my first time to ever work with Tomas. So it's my basic scripting style we used for this, which is, not too descriptive, but I like to flourish the script for inspiration and stuff. But Giorello's sense of composition, his classic compositional style, his illustrative kind of like attack on line work and pencil work and stuff, his designs, his costumes, his sets, and then finally the way he uses shapes, both as a whole page, but also in each individual panel, the way the eye is drawn across the panel. It's all extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. Yeah.
It's an amazing looking book. So
yeah, man, it's so awesome.
Good luck with that. As we close off, my last question is what's up with you and Valiant?
Oh, right. So I think this might be the first time I've talked about this since the article. I mean, they just don't, they don't, I tried to get a hold of them. about the rights issues in our contracts. We had, for anyone who doesn't know, all of us who signed with the most recent incarnation of Valiant had a royalty pool in our contracts. And I received monies from Sony's options of Harbinger from that royalty pool. Now, I have since learned that other people didn't receive money from the royalty pool during the original, when Dinesh Shimdasani was the CEO. But I did, and I see that as precedent. And now a very large deal was made with Paramount to buy the Harbinger property outright for film. And we're not seeing any money from it, me or any of the other creators who should be in that royalty pool, which includes, Jim Shooter and David Lapham, who should obviously have the largest amount of that pool. So I just wanted to talk about it publicly. I did contact Valiant several times through several different people over the course of, months and months. I mean, it's been a couple of years since I've been trying to talk to somebody about this. I didn't want to go public because I don't want freelancers working at Valiant to be harmed. And I don't want editors to be harmed or marketing people. I don't want anybody who's out there in the trenches to be harmed by this. But, it is a very different company now. And by talking about it, I get to talk about how, in general, our industry is the substrate of all pop culture. And there's very few of us that make any kind of a standard living doing this without a real hustle. And so, we're not unionized. No one has to honor our contracts. If they don't honor them, it's a huge, expensive legal battles. They have more money than we do. So I just wanted to talk about that and let people know there's a reason why I wasn't creating a Valiant anymore. And the reason is because I don't believe the current Valiant company honors its contracts or respects its creators. So yeah, that's what's going on.
That's unfortunate. I feel like this has happened with Valiant before.
I know, it's fascinating. One could almost write a book about the rise and fall of Valiant through the ages. In many ways, it's sort of the American story, right? Like people with vision come in and they build something, and then people who could have never built that thing take it from them and drive it into the ground because there's no passion, there's only greed, or there's only an asset hoarding mentality from those people. And so, right now, I haven't seen anything to the contrary that's not what Valiant is now. Is we've moved away from the phase of the people with passion who believed in it, building something, and into the phase where that thing is taken from them and driven into the ground in an attempt to, I don't know, launder money. I don't know what, I don't know. But, I don't have any, I mean no ill harm to, I want every freelancer who's working on a book there, I want them to be successful. And every editor, it's fun to get to make comics, and I hope everyone's getting paid and their contracts are honored.
All right. Thank you, Joshua Dysart, for joining the Comics Cube. Odinns Eye is out December 1, 2021, 72-page first issue. And whoever owns the rights
Wednesday in December.
Every Wednesday in December. And whoever owns the rights to Underdog, go contact Joshua.
Let me know. Let's do it. Wasn't there a Ralph Bakshi Underdog? No. Didn't somebody do? I forget who did the cartoon. Yeah.
Ralph.
Somebody interesting did the recent Underdog, not recent, but in the last 30 years.
Oh, the Mighty Heroes by Ralph Bakshi was a Saturday morning cartoon in it looks like the 80s, and Underdog was on it.
That's what I'm talking about. I don't think I can do better than Bakshi, but I could try.
It's a different medium.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Joshua.
Awesome.